to Bruce earlier, I have got a new computer system, and I'm not exactly struggling with it, but it's not as familiar as it has been in the past. So if I'm a bit hesitant sometime, it's because I'm switching between screens and trying to catch up with things. Okay, welcome everyone. It's good to see you all. I'm just looking at the agenda. And we start off with a membership and a membership update. Can I just add here at the beginning, is Faye Hartland on the screen? I can't see her.
She is, Chair.
Yeah, I'm here, but my camera's not working. Hi.
All right, welcome Faye from considerable distance. I think it's worth recording in the minutes that Faye, this is Faye's last meeting. She's actually retiring at Christmas. Is that right, Faye?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I remember sitting beside you at your first meeting and discussing the weather, because I don't think it was that good, and you'd come a long way.
Yeah. No, it's nice not to have to travel, but it's sunny here today, so.
That is good. Faye, thank you very much, because you've done 8 years on the forum, and it is much appreciated, especially as a lot of the time you've had to cover quite some distance. So thank you on behalf of the forum for everything, and best wishes for the future.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Bruce, anything else on membership and membership update?
Nothing particularly, Colin. What we're proposing to do, that following this meeting, when we go to consult with schools on the funding values for 23-24, we're going to seek sort of a wider schools forum membership and attempt to refresh at that point, on the basis of if somebody is passionate enough to complete the school consultation, it may be something they want to get involved in. So that's the approach we're going to take.
That sounds a good combination of things. Yeah, fine. Nothing else on that?
No, nothing else specifically around membership. Thank you.
Okay. Apologies. Do we have any apologies, Andrea?
Chair,
we have apologies from Andrew Felwell, Mike Finley, and Councillor Wearmouth.
Right. Okay, thank you. Any other two apologies to add to that from anyone else? No. Okay.
Apologies. I should note Mike may be struggling. Mike Dean Hall. You unfortunately had an urgent school issue he had to attend that he found out last night, so I had an email through. I'm sure he'd want that recorded.
Yes, please. Okay, moving to disclosure of interests, if any. Give you a few seconds to think about that. That seems to be no. That's Mike Dean Hall arriving now. And now to item 4, minutes and matters arising. Can we take accuracy and comments, matters arising together? Page 1, anyone? Page 2? Page 3, anything on the funding formula, I think we can assume will be covered by this morning's agenda. Page 5, page 6, which is the end. Can I assume there are no queries on the minutes of the last meeting?
True record, Chair.
Thank you, Graham. Okay, on to item 5.
Without the risk of being a smarty pants, apologies if this was mentioned, but 14.17, I don't think that paragraph is finished off.
Oh yes, thank you. You're quite right. I spotted that and I've failed to mark it. Yes, thank you, Graham.
Very welcome.
I think it's been extended unnecessarily. I suggest that it would be appropriate, it should be noted, it was noted that there is a lot of uncertainty at the present time, which is still very much the case, and delete the following 5 words. Apologies for that. Thank you, Graham.
Okay. Andrea, you'll correct that in the minutes. Okay, thank you for that. Item 5, communication. Bruce.
2 items under communication. The first is the draft minutes of the Formula Funding Subcommittee held on the Tuesday, the 1st of November, a couple of weeks ago. They're attached. Obviously, they haven't yet been to Formula Funding Subcommittee, but we were keen to get one in before this meeting. I think, as it stands there, we had a presentation to Formula Funding Subcommittee, which it was felt to be helpful for those committee members, but it was too much information for the purposes of this meeting. I think we've highlighted the key issues in the report. Items for worth highlighting is the fact that the minimum per pupil funding was again discussed and the impact of that. Again, we've highlighted the potential impact and the number of schools potentially involved. Again, with the usual caveat, it's based on last year's data in the reported item 10. The issue in terms of the transfer between blocks was raised in schools block. That's something that has been subject to discussion subsequently within Northumberland, and it is dealt with in item 10. We are requesting a 0.25% transfer at this stage, but again, there's more context within the agenda item 10.
Yeah, if we can we leave that to the main item on the agenda? Thank you, Bruce. Can I just thank everyone for who attended that meeting? That was very helpful, and particular thanks to Ben Watson for chairing it. Ben can't make it this morning, but he did chair that meeting. Okay.
We should also note, sorry, Colin, we should note Ben's apologies as well. If
yes, of course. Thank you. So any broad points on that? That's not on those minutes. That's not likely to come up later in the meeting. Okay, Bruce, moving on then to the F40.
Yes, again, we share some of the edited highlights from the F40 group we receive, and we thought it was worth highlighting the letter to the incoming Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, as at page 11 and onwards. That's obviously a letter that's been prepared and submitted by the F40 group. Page 11, page 12. Although it's not evident from that graph, we should note that actually Northumberland, if you blow your picture up large enough, is actually the third best funded, and I use the term sort of loosely, of the Formula Fund 40 authorities highlighted in orange. I think that position has improved over the last 3 or 4 years because of the position we took in relation to sparsity, the lobbying we did, and then the subsequent increase in the sparsity funding has, helped the authorities' position overall.
Okay, thank you for that. I signed up to get all of the F40 stuff, and I mean, I have to say, they are very active, and I'm always impressed with how quickly they pick things up and how cogent they are with their arguments. So, I think I certainly appreciate that. Okay, any questions, comments on the F40 paper? Okay, moving on. Item 6, funding for Ukrainian students. Is this Bruce again?
This one is Colin. Yes, I'll be passing the mic over very swiftly. But first of all, we've had a number of inquiries from schools in relation who support in supporting and taking in students, who've moved from Ukraine, obviously due to the current situation over there. We sent. It's important to say that we sent a message out to schools via the e-courier update yesterday as well, and all schools should certainly be in receipt of that. We've outlined the approach we've taken in terms of the distribution of funds below. We've now calculated and are ready to distribute the funds for the summer term, when they'll go out before the end of November. And again, I've had some input and my thanks to assistance to a couple of school directors of resources and business managers for a sanity check in relation to that. That proved extremely helpful. So there is essentially £158,000 going to go out to the end of November, and that does include a handful of PVIs as well, Kath. And I know that we've been working with the EY team in relation to that. It's been appreciated. I have to highlight it again that the funding that has been made available is only available to families that have entered through the Homes for Ukraine scheme. We contacted both the ESFA and the DULUC, the Department of Levelling Up Homes and Communities. I revel in that title. In relation to that, just to point out that the apparent anomaly in relation to that, the government's view is very much that if families are coming in outside of the Homes for Ukraine scheme, they should simply receive support through the usual support channels available.
What are the usual support channels available?
Well, there is a range of resources highlighted on the Northumberland Education website under a specific session in terms of Ukraine. Again, the support is available through the asylum team and also through specialist education teams such as the EAL team. Ironically, that's one of the teams we've highlighted previously about carrying forward funds for demands very much such as this.
Yeah. Okay. Offhand, do you know how many students are covered by this in Northumberland, Bruce?
It's increasing.
Yeah.
I'm going to film just while I pull up a separate spreadsheet. Just bear with me, Colin.
Sorry to put you on the spot. It was just
no.
It's interesting.
I think it's in the region of, it's three figures certainly. I believe it's in the region of it's certainly in the region maybe 140 in terms of the last data I got, but that is increasing. It's clearly a situation that's changing, on a month-to-month basis.
Mm-hmm.
As outlined in the paper of the report, we will get to the stage where students who are now in school and have been in school since the start of the September term will feature as part of the standard October school census return, which feeds subsequent years funding return starting April 23-24, or of course September for academies. So they will feed through in relation to that. So we don't know if there will be any additional funding available after the end of the current financial year.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's very, very dynamic. Audrey, you've put your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say that we are still receiving families and children into Northumberland, not quite at the rate that we did some while ago, but they are still arriving and we do continue to place them. I think it's worth noting, and Bruce will tell me whether I'm wrong on this, but I believe we passport 100% of the monies received across the schools. That's right, Bruce, isn't it?
Yeah, as in the report, the figures there of the 3,000, 6,588.75, we're passing that on, split over the 3 terms.
Yeah, so all of that monies, and I'm saying that I am aware of some authorities that are not passporting the 100% direct into schools, recognising that we are, I guess, lucky enough in Northumberland, but have planned for some of this to some extent, to have a set of services that are able to wrap around children and families. We were able to do some rapid response work with families and community work, and also have increased the resource available through the EAL team to be able to do that support. So we do passport over 100% direct to schools so that they've got every penny that they can use really to support these children.
Very good, thank you for that. Does anyone want to make any comments about this or ask any further questions? It's obviously a situation changing frequently.
Can I just say, Colin, anecdotally, I have 4 Ukrainian children in my school. I only have 70 children on roll, so 4 is quite a large proportion of them, and passing all of the money on is really useful. We've actually employed through a supply agency a tutor to work with us and Longhorton Primary and Hipsburn Primary, so that they can come in and without the knowledge of all of that money coming across, it would have made it incredibly challenging for us.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. That's very positive. Mike Dean Hall.
Yep. Morning. Just to add to that as well, from anecdote, we've got a couple of children, one at each school here in Wooler and Glendale, and the support worker coming in through the local authority aspect of this has kicked in and is positive as well. So just a bit extra feedback on that too, which is separate to the funds coming through directly to schools, but it is positive. Smashing. Graham Wilkins.
Yes, Chair. Can you obviously identify which areas in Northumberland these children are in? Would be very useful.
Yes, we can. They're all over, Graham.
Yeah.
We do have some particular hotspots, and I'm just looking at the application spreadsheet. So at the moment, we have 277 children who've
Wow.
arrived in Northumberland. So it's quite substantial numbers.
Yeah.
We were probably around May, early June time, we were around the 220-40 number at that point. So it has continued to increase, but slightly slowed down. I think there is I'm going to say a map. I'll try and find that for you, and I'll ask Andrea to share it out with the minutes if we can find that, just to give an idea of distribution around the county.
Yeah, it'd be very useful because in my school we have obviously we're not up in Pan in a lot of our year groups, so we have spaces to actually take them, but we have never received any as yet into the
Yeah.
All right.
And some of that's due to location, isn't it? And wherever the host families are offering their availability.
Yeah.
So we do have to obviously rely on that. And what I desperately am trying to do is not have more children crisscrossing Northumberland.
Yeah.
So, desperately trying to do the meet needs much closer to home as one of our priorities. However, there are some occasions when, we have got children travelling because of their particular needs. So I'll try and find that heat map for you, Graham, and get that sent out to Andrea. And then she can distribute with the minutes for everyone.
Thank you.
Certainly initial patterns in reflecting the way the funding's been distributed. There were a number of families hosting in both the west and the north of the borough initially, particularly. I mean, again, it was spread throughout the authority, but that was particularly prevalent. Again, Morpeth again being a little bit of a centre as well. So
yeah. Okay. I think it'd be interesting to pick that up from the minutes at a later meeting anyway, and find out how that is progressing. Thank you for that. Okay, can we move on to item 7, the SEN update? And David, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, everybody. You've obviously got in the minutes there the report, which was drafted really, I think, initially by Nicola Taylor before she left to pastures new. And ordinarily it probably would have been Mike Finley who would have been presenting this today, but Mike's actually at a funeral, so that's the reason why he's not here. The report indicates the work going on in the NICE teams. So this is the centrally based teams who support high incidence special needs. So we're talking about the autism support team, we're talking about the behaviour support team, we're talking about specific learning difficulties team, and also speech, language and communication team. So those are the groups that are involved. The first part of the report's a little bit of background, and I'll just give a few sentences to summarise that really. In 2018, there was a local area inspection, so an Ofsted inspection of SEND provision in Northumberland. We did get a written letter for improvement following that, which we've been re-inspected since then, and that's been withdrawn. But at that point in time, one of the aspects for development was around specialist support into mainstream schools. And one of the things that the Ofsted found at the time was that although there was specialist support, that actually the delivery of it was not consistent across schools. They sort of left us with that as a poser, and really in communication with schools, what we found was something we'd been indicated that at that point in time, those services were paid for on an SLA basis, and that there was a number of hours that schools bought per year. If your needs matched the number of hours you could afford to pay, then that was fine, and you got the support from the teams, and that helped support the school meet the needs of the learners. But actually, if you had a particular spike in SEN or a particular really high needs case, and you needed a significant additional number of hours on top of that you would generally budgeted for, it was then really down to the ability of the school to pay. And Ofsted quite rightly indicated that led to some inconsistencies, and obviously we all wanted a universal approach across Northumberland. The solution to that was brought to Schools Forum. There was probably a number of papers and a high number of discussions actually, both in subcommittees and by the forum themselves, in an attempt to move to a free point of delivery service for the NICE teams, for the teams that I mentioned earlier, so that any school in Northumberland could access those services at the degree needed in order to support the needs of the learners that they had on roll at that point in time. The way that was funded then was that the SLA system where schools paid individually was stopped, and from September 2020 the services were funded from the high needs block, but on the back of a transfer from the designated schools grant. So it was the money that comes to schools at that point in time, 1% of that value was transferred into the high needs block, with specifically the target of funding these teams, so that the mainstream schools that were collectively paying for it could all access it on an equal level, regardless of whether you had a high proportion of SEND or not. That was the luck of the draw. So really that's the background since that point, and I think it's going to be discussed in item 10, I think, Bruce, as well. The actual percentage that's been moved from the full schools block into the high needs block has been reduced since that time, and I think Bruce has some other indications for discussion via the forum about what that should look like going forwards. So I'll skip that for the moment because Bruce will come back to it. But the general impact, the rest of the report really tries to highlight some impact, and this can be a bit of a challenge highlighting impact for a service which is preventative. It's a bit difficult to prove that you've stopped something more significant happening than actually being able to by the delivery of your work. But this is a starter for 10 really, in terms of trying to demonstrate the impact of the teams, certainly since the September 2020 and since the schools block, high needs block have been funding the teams directly. So just the highlights really, there has been an increase in referrals into the team, 42% increase in referrals in the timescale. You'll see all the tables and graphs have got a dip for COVID. There were less pupils in school at that point in time, so we can understand why there would have been less referrals at that point in time. But over the full time period, which spans COVID, we're certainly looking now at a 42% increase in referrals. There's been a 16% increase in the number of schools making referrals. So we're in a position now where virtually all schools are making referrals into these services, and that wasn't the case before. And whether that was unmet need or undiagnosed need, or people actually holding back because they didn't have the money to engage with the services, I think that one in particular is a key statistic to demonstrate the increase in the number of schools making referrals and accessing the service than there was before. There's a training offer that comes alongside the individual work with pupils and school leaders and SENCOs and class teachers on the ground. And there's been a 42% increase in the training offer from prior to the way this funding was arranged. A 15% increase in the staff accessing that training. Slightly conversely, there has been a decrease over the time period in the number of schools. So the overall number of staff in Northumberland engaging in the training is up 15%. But actually, of the schools accessing the training, which is in addition to the face-to-face work on site, there's been a 19% decrease. So those schools that are taking advantage of the training are getting more staff on there. But we do need to consider that there are some schools that have failed to access or not managed to access the training. Whether that's because some of those individuals will just be that they don't have those needs within their schools. Having said that, I have been to this forum before. We're all acutely aware of the increase in demand for from a special educational needs basis, and you would have thought more schools would have accessed more of the training. But the data at the minute doesn't tell us that. So we've got to do some work to make sure that schools are able to access the training. The online nature that we're all used to certainly has helped increase the overall numbers, but maybe online doesn't suit some schools, and we do a lot more face-to-face now than we did 12 months ago, but possibly we need to continue with the development of the face-to-face offer, because it could be that some schools go, that's the offer we want. We don't actually want the virtual offer, even though overall that has increased numbers. It might have turned a couple of schools away or what have you. So there is some work to do there to ensure that the percentage of schools accessing training goes back to the levels it was, at least, if not greater than that. We've surveyed the users of the service, and had a number of responses come through, and some of the pie charts indicate those responses. The impact indicated by the users is that they believe there's been an increase in equity, which was one of the key driving points of actually having this system in place. There's better support for the graduated approach for teachers in the classroom. Complex cases overall do get more access, so maybe that's a reflection of some schools who had complex cases in the past but ran out of hours, literally, and therefore felt that complex cases weren't getting the support that was required. There's a thumbs up for single referral, so that's not necessarily related to the way the teams are now organised, funded, should I say, but in the way they are organised is that before you might have had to do a different referral to autism support, and then a different referral to behaviour support, and so on and so forth. And even though a lot of that would be copy and pasting, it's still a pain in the neck.
Yeah.
If you refer into Hint now, you refer to all those services, and actually, we all know primary need for special education needs isn't the only need, and that usually a blended approach is one that impacts the highest to support the learner in making the right progress. There's been better involvement from the children and young people themselves in their plans, because the teams are all very focused on gaining the voice of the learner and the families in developing plans, which is super important, but also can be an area of challenge sometimes, just because that can be a complex thing to do. And the overall feedback from the survey was that we were in a better position overall than prior to this system being in place. There were some question marks thrown out there, and I think we do all collectively as a forum need to be conscious about this. One of the is about waiting times.
Yeah.
Ideally, we the learner deserves to have their needs met today. And actually, any waiting time, from my perspective, is probably not acceptable. Back in the real world, in terms of massively increased demand and a limited, though a growing capacity, and I think the report does indicate some growth in some of the teams, whether we've been able to grow the teams rapidly enough to meet the increase in demand, I think the answer is probably no. So they've gone further and done more, but there is more to do. And so that watching of waiting times and ensuring that reduces, I think, is a key element for the work of the teams going forwards. But all of us just being understanding of the increase in demand, which everyone here is having to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
I know, but collectively it's repeated across the county and across the country. So we just need to be aware of that in terms of looking at plans for the future. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, can I throw the first one in, David? Is it possible to say whether you feel that putting this into mainstream schools has kept a greater proportion of children with special needs in those schools, or is that too oblique to really evaluate?
I'd love to show you a graph of that, Colin, where the data packs up. I think what we've got to, if we could probably do something where we look at I think it's really clear to say that there are there are more learners with special educational needs having their needs well met in our mainstream schools than ever before.
Okay.
And of those learners, the actual degree of their need overall is higher than it ever has been before. This is exceptionally anecdotal, but we have had some learners move from our special schools back into our mainstream schools.
Gosh, right. Yeah.
So that's anecdotal, but again would indicate the degree of specialism which now exists within our mainstream schools.
Mm.
That has been as a response to the demand as well. So it is difficult to balance, basically.
Yeah,
Colin,
I know, but
it
does sound positive. Keith Dickinson, you have your hand up. Sorry, Kath Dickinson. Oh, sorry, Kath.
I was just wondering whether those figures related just to schools or whether there was anything in there in relation to PVIs.
There is a slightly different, though we're trying to blend it more, system for support in our across our early years, PVIs and also nurseries in schools, where we do within the early years team we have a number of inclusion consultants. We've actually grown that group now, so you know them well, Kath. They come and work with your good self on a regular basis. And I think we're probably due another report from that service in terms of how the current inclusion fund for early years has been spent, about the number of referrals that come into early years, and also some of the outcomes from those referrals as well. The figures that you're looking at here are really reception age upwards.
Well, thank you.
Okay. I mean, it sounds a very positive report, David. Graham Wilkins, are you able to
I would say
affirm that?
Yes, I would say very clearly. Thank you, David, for doing the report. I mean, it's excellent work that is being done in Northumberland. As you may know, I do a lot of school appeals across the 9 local authorities, and I have found that in a lot of our schools now across the northeast, the number of children on the SEND register is going up and up. The number of children with educational care plan is going up in all authorities. But I can see Northumberland is leading the way quite well, hitting the target straight away. You know, when a child needs help, it's there now to be done and everything like that, right? And it's great to hear that children in special educational setting are coming back into mainstream, which what it should be all about as well. Yeah. So keep up the good work, David, and everything, and Audrey as well. Keep the pressure up, and we'll get it all sorted out.
Thanks, Graham. Graham Atkins.
Yeah, thanks for that, Colin. Thanks, David. And some of us have been on Schools Forum for a number of years. I think, I hate to think how many, I think it's probably about 6 or 7 for me, possibly more. And, you know, a perennial issue was SEND and the fact that there was always a demand for more funding. And I think, you know, that there have been definite improvements in recent times. And there was new personnel that came in, I don't know, 2018, 17, 18, 19, that shifted things forward. I think it's worth making the point that on the ground in schools, the system is broken in terms of there just simply isn't enough funding for the needs that exist. And the whole issue around notional funding, I know there have been changes there to try and address some of the concerns, but there just simply isn't enough money in the system to meet the needs in school. So where I was thinking we need to get onto as a schools forum, because it's interesting to understand the kind of educational dimension to it, and that's an important factor, but we need to understand it, I guess, from a financial perspective. And later on in the papers, it talks about overspends and underspends. It talks about the carry forward. It talks about the 0.25 going from the schools block to high needs, which is, you know, I think is all valid stuff. I just wonder if we're at a point where we need to have as a schools forum, a bit of a strategic take on, right, where is high needs funding going? What are the demands looking like? And all the analysis we did in the past, where we understood a lot of money was going out of the county to places that were provided in other authorities and the expense of that, and you know, things have moved on since then. But just have a take on where we're going strategically with SEND in relation to the funding. AP has been mentioned in the papers, and there are increasing demands there. There's been a whole piece of work around the strategy around alternate provision, how that fits in, but also understanding what the demands on the schools block are. So we know that the NFF directs funding to individual schools, but there's quite a significant underspend, which if there hadn't been a transfer, it would have been over £1 million. How should schools block money be spent? Should that be in schools, or is it the budgeting needs to be revisited, and the allocation of the schools block needs to be lower and higher to the high needs block? So I think there's a huge piece of work, as I see it, from our point of view as a schools forum, to look at it strategically in relation to how the funding works and whether it's working as best as it can at that high level.
Right, Graham, that's quite a challenge. There are various hands up, and Audrey was the third of three, but I'm going to go to Audrey first because of you know, the strategic nature of what Graham's just suggested there. Audrey?
No pressure than Colin or Graham in terms of responding to that. I mean, actually, I think that's a really good ask, Graham. So where we are currently, so I'm going to say Northumberland are not on any radars for all the wrong reasons. You know, our high needs budget we manage well. It's not without its challenges and this toing and froing. We manage that really well. There are multiple authorities, and this is in the public domain, who are significantly overspent in terms of that. So understanding where we are now, our current position, but also looking at our SEN challenges as they will continue to escalate for the next 5 to 6 years. We've just done a significant piece of work around SEN place planning. And the do nothing scenario is, if we continue in our trajectory, we will require another additional 770 places over the next 5 years. Yes, Colin, I should have told you to grab your chair and not fall off it at that point. So that's a do nothing scenario, but actually some of the work that we've just talked about, particularly around inclusive ed services, particularly around AP that Graham talked about, and actually our inclusion in mainstream schools, you know, how are we as a collective going to look at the financial side? Because actually I've got a group of head teachers who are also meeting to look at, okay, how do we look at the inclusion side, and probably having a bit of a summit around what the challenges will be place-based for us in Northumberland around that growing challenge. I agree, Graham, the funding isn't sufficient. I think out of the papers that were published earlier this year, my gut feeling is the green paper will survive, and we will continue down the trajectory of the green paper. It is out as a consultation, it's not out as a white paper yet, but there will become some even more challenging circumstances that we will need to respond to. And I think it's a really good shout to say, let's get together and let's do some deeper analysis and help us all, because I'm guessing there'll be some people on Schools Forum thinking, actually, I'm not tied into this as much as I need to be. Some colleagues on the call are not decision making in terms of high needs because it's not coming into their budget, but actually being a member of this forum and how holding that responsibility, I think, is really important. So for me, having a summit around what this could mean for us and help everybody understand the decision making and the future challenges, I think is hugely important. So I'd support doing, getting us all together in a room. Actually, I'd like us all face to face to be doing this.
Wow. Have you anything specific in mind? I mean, that sounds fairly specific, but I'm thinking about how and when, Audrey.
Not yet.
Okay.
You know, off the back of talking to Graham, I think I'll have another conversation with Graham and David. David might want to come in,
Yeah.
but we'll think about how, when, I mean, certainly into the new year. I don't think we could squeeze that in before Christmas, but I'd think into the new year. I mean, we'll happily host it at County Hall, but we'll happily go out to school as well. If any school would like to host it and can manage us all into a space, then we'd very happily come out to do that, I think.
Okay.
Can I just come in, Colin, please?
Well,
Right.
sorry, I think I need to take people in order, Graham. David, can you've had your hand up for a while, and Nicola, I haven't forgotten about you.
Yeah. The report that I've presented is relatively positive about the work of those teams. The bit that I left at the end was about waiting times and that reflection. I think I said multiple times through the reflection of the massively increased demand with SEND needs, and that is falling predominantly upon mainstream schools as we speak, even though the special schools themselves have a significant pressure on them in terms of the demand for them. Their 16% growth in the last year, for example, is an indication of the pressure that's on them to deliver. The finances for in and around SEND, I think in the past, the way we've structured it and the way the formulas have gone about and so on and so forth have been a bit theoretical, possibly, if that's the best word for it, and haven't made so much sense on the ground. So we do have some schools who are exceptionally aware of their SEND funding that comes to them and how they can gain additional funding and how the systems work and so on. So we've got some schools really well placed with that. And we've got some other schools that aren't as well placed, and some schools have some perceptions about funding. It's enough, it's not enough, it's so on and so forth. I'm currently in my weekend work. I'm actually developing a tool which at the moment is trying to identify the SEND gap, and by the SEND gap I mean the SEND funding gap. And I'm working with a couple of schools, one high school and 3 primary schools, 1 first school, to see how it works for them on the ground and to see whether the funding gap tool I'm developing will correctly identify where the income and the expenditure around SEND is, the gap between the two. So once I've sort of trialed it with some real life cases, I'd be really keen to maybe bring some of that back to forum. Or maybe there's another step in between. Maybe it's to talk with Audrey's forum there, her group of schools and what have you, and again try and apply the methodology to them, because I do think this is just it's an informed gut feeling. We will find some schools significantly underfunded for their SEND needs.
Okay.
But we will also find some schools which have more money coming in for SEND that they're actually spending on other things, no doubt legitimately on really appropriate, because it's not ring-fenced in the school's budget, but actually some schools that are in a better position than others because they have the same funding streams, access to the same funding streams, but not as many learners with the high needs.
Okay.
And I think both may well come out, but proving it to schools and them knowing themselves, having this clear understanding about the global SEND funding and each individual learner, we need more understanding on that, I think, to help schools state their case, because we do need to fund special educational needs properly, of course.
Right. Graham, well done. You've really thrown down the gauntlet there in a very positive way. I'm very conscious that we could spend the rest of the meeting talking about this, and it's so important, but it's not the main purpose of this meeting, which is the DSG projection. So I would like to sort of pause there if I can. Nicola, Bruce, Graham Wilkins, you've all sort of tried to interject. Is there anything that's really necessary to interject with now, or can we leave things with Audrey and David and Graham Atkins perhaps to come up with proposals for some kind of summit?
Chair, yes, obviously as chair of the high need block, I must kind of just remind everybody what it was like a few years ago, how overspent we were. And it wasn't because of the excellent work done by the high need teams, the high needs committee. We've actually got back in line. So yes, it's thing. So yeah, I think we need to have a high needs committee meeting again somewhere and look at what Audrey says and everything like that, and what Graham's proposed as well. So
smashing. Nicola, I'm sorry you've had to wait so long.
No, that's like it is a really quick point. The funding around SEN absolutely is clearly key, but the funding is there largely to support staffing. And one of the massive issues in schools at the moment is the lack of support staff to be able to support those children. And so there is a massive piece that needs to be done around making that look attractive in our county to find the people to do those jobs, because otherwise you can have all the money in the world, but if you can't get the staff to provide it, then it's absolutely useless.
Very good point, Nicola. Thank you.
Really good point.
Yeah. Bruce, were you just going to try and bring us back on track, or did you have something specific to say?
I'm not trying to bring anybody back on track, Colin. I was just picking up comments made by David, Graham, and to an extent Graham Atkins as well. Graham's again highlighted the High Needs Committee, and I think we are looking to put a committee in early in 2023. And again, there may be there'll be a key role for that in some of the work streams emerging from discussions over the last 10 minutes, I think. Colin, you're muted at this point, certainly for me.
I am. Sorry. I'm going to end this discussion on 2 points. Thank you very much, David Street. And I think we all consider that, the SEN team, the inclusion service, are doing an excellent job, and the initiative is a very good one. But we acknowledge, that there are big issues to be faced. And Audrey, can you make proposals for that? It's scarcely down to the forum. It's a much bigger thing than that. But I think the forum would very much like to monitor that, what you're planning, and to have input to it.
Yeah, definitely, Chair.
Okay, so you will bring something back both to the forum and wider, maybe in early 23.
Yeah, let's have a discussion outside here. What the best thing to the best vehicle and the best purpose of and use of time to be able to achieve that.
Okay, many thanks, everybody. That was very, very helpful. Okay, moving on to item 8, and this is a DSG carryover, which I think is this more technical than anything else, Bruce? Or
yes.
It is. Abby, you were going to speak to this.
Can you hear me okay? I'm just in a tiny meeting room. It seems quite echoey. Is that okay?
I can hear you fine.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yes, so the legislation's changed around the DSG and how we treat surplus and deficits at year end over the last couple of years. So now for any organisations in a deficit at the end of the financial year, that has to be carried forward and ring fenced, and the local authority is not allowed to contribute towards the deficit. It must be recovered in future years or carried forward in sort of year on year. Now we're not in that position, we're in a surplus. So when you hold a DSG surplus, you have to create a DSG reserve now, which just means we're ring fencing the DSG balance. It's held in a separate account. It can't be held with our school balances any longer. It must be held separately and ring fenced for the purpose of the grant. So at the end of the year, we reported in July that we ended the year with just over a 4 million surplus on the DSG. So that's all gone into the reserve initially at end of year, and we had an underspend on all of our blocks at the end of the financial year last year. And we said in July that we'd come back to you and just report and update you on where we were with our plans to use that carry forward, sort of what demands we've got on it for this financial year. And the rules now allow us to just transport some of this funding through to 23-24, but we need to consult with Schools Forum if we plan to do that. And that is what we're proposing at the moment, based on what we've identified as this year's needs and the upcoming pressures for the future. So in terms of our demands for this year, the key one that sort of everyone is aware of is the pay award for 22-23. So whilst we'd built in a proposal of pay award for both and this is for our centrally funded staff, this is separate to the schools themselves. The pay awards are all coming out, as they are across the council, all coming out at significantly higher than what we'd set aside. So we've identified we need to use some of that carry forward to meet the gap in funding for the pay award for 22-23. We've also had a number of posts. You may recall we had a number of SEN posts, mainly across SEN support, but also in the inclusion service that were temporarily funded. They were fixed term posts to be funded from the Contain Outbreak Management Grant, which was a COMF. It's called COMF. It was brought in to support the authority moving out of the COVID and the impact. And it's a council-wide grant, but we were able to secure some of that funding for education. So we created probably around 8 posts that were fixed term posts. Now, the COMF funding runs out approximately December this year. It has gone on slightly longer than we anticipated, but what the proposal is to extend some of those posts either up to the end of the financial year or the end of the academic year. So we're going to use some of our carry forward just to keep that continuity of those posts rolling forward and the good work that they're doing, just in continuing to support our schools as they still recover from the impact of the pandemic. There are some areas of the carry forward we have to bring forward, and they're ring fenced specifically within the DSG. So we've brought these forward already to forum, but there is the trade union facility time budget, the English as an additional language, and there is also an area within early years, the Disability Access Fund, that are all ring fenced within the wider DSG. So we've got to bring that money forward for each of those services individually. And then the last commitment we identified for this year was around just creating a bit of a contingency for our nursery funding. And you may recall last year we uplifted our nursery rates over and above the uplift we got from government coming in. So we raised them slightly higher, and that brings with it a degree of risk because our nursery funding won't be confirmed really until July next year. So by creating a little bit of a contingency fund, we'll know, we should have an idea at the end of March where we are with that, but at least that's a bit of a buffer in case we do move in towards an overspend on the in-the-air grant. So those are the commitments we've identified so far from the carry forward from 21-22, and what we're proposing is that the remainder of the balance we will roll forward. We'll leave it in the reserve this year and we'll just roll it forward into 23-24 because we're aware of the pressures that are coming up in the next few years, not just next year alone. So that amounts to 2.9 million. Looking ahead at our future pressures, we have already started our planning on both the school, well, on all of the blocks really. So we've started planning and pulling through a draft position for what we're expecting sort of our current budget to look like and what are the pressures that are coming forward. And the things we've identified already are the future pay awards. We do have a lot of centrally funded teachers. Obviously there's been a teacher pay award agreed and is going to be paid, but it's still under discussion and negotiation. We've got the pay awards for 23-24 coming up. We've also got the impact of inflation on our contracts. There's been a significant impact for the wider council on fuel. We do have some transport costs go through the DSG around our alternative provision and also around the EOTA students, the education other than at school. So there is a degree of inflation on those costs, but we are seeing it even more so on the cost of the contracts related to independent school places and alternative providers, where the demand is growing, the supply is short, and the costs are rising across the board. So those areas we are seeing an overspend this year. So we know that's going to continue to grow. We've also got, just as we've all discussed, the continued rise in demand for alternative provision, and particularly both special school places and our learners within HCP plan. This links into additional top-ups. Our top-ups are overspent significantly at the moment. So growth in top-up funding and for wider SEN support for our maintained schools. So we know that's an area we're going to need to put more into. And finally, the other pressure we've identified is the upcoming school reorganisations across the Berwick and the Coquet partnerships. So that could lead to some demands on the Central Schools block in particular. So it's in our interest, having spoke to all of the budget managers, that it would be best just to roll this money forward at this point in time rather than identify one-off uses for this carry forward, because it isn't recurrent. It is just used there, available for, once we've used it, it's gone. It would be better to roll it forward at this point in time, but build that into our planning for next year and beyond. So at least we know that we have that available. I should say that when we end the financial year, if we are overspent this year on our DSG, then we will be able to draw from the reserve what we need to meet the overspend. And if we underspend at year end, that balance will also just transfer into the reserve and roll forward. And we'll do the same next year as well.
Thanks. Sorry, go on.
No, that's it. That's all really for the carry forward. It's just to make you aware that's what our proposal was. And if anybody has any questions on that specific report, I'm happy to take them.
Okay, questions for Abby? Anyone? Abby, that was very, very clear. Thank you. I've learned a lot from that. I think the key thing that I take away is it doesn't matter how much carry forward we have, there is always plenty of pressure that can be anticipated. And but we are fortunate that we have a bit of elbow room, because it certainly looks like next year we're going to need it. But thank you for that, Abby. Thank you. Okay. Moving on then. Item 9.
Oh, Colin.
Yeah.
Sorry, Colin. Can I just come in there? It was just a query in relation to the schools block, which has been underspent and is contributing quite a significant carry forward. I think the point was made, if there hadn't been the transfer to high needs, it would have been over £1 million. I'm just not clear in my head why that is underspent to the extent that it is. I just wondered if there was just an explanation around that.
Mm-hmm. I think with the schools block itself, it was looking back to last year, we had some growth funding set aside for growth in our places from September onwards that we didn't need in the end. That was at some of our, from recollection, it was some of our middle schools that went to primary. We'd set aside more than we needed. That led to a bit of an underspend. We also recovered some funding related to Haltwhistle. Am I right, Bruce? I think it was Haltwhistle Middle School. When the middle school closed, with it being an academy, we actually got a refund of place funding for 7/12 of the year. Even though that it didn't close last year, we only received the funding back last year. So that contributed to the underspend. There was also some underspend on our contingency budget last year. And I think we received back the other things. When a school converts to an academy, depending on what point in the year they go, any that go at the beginning of the year or in the first, I think it's the first 5 months, we will have had to set their budget and include them on the usual APT, the budget planning tool, and that includes giving them a full allocation for rates. So then any schools that have thereafter converted, they receive a reduction in their rates down to the 20%. So we quite often get a lump sum back in terms of rates funding. And I think we had one go last year, but we'd had a couple go the previous year. So there was some income came back that way. I mean, with the schools block, the issue with the schools block is it's quite rigid. There's not a lot we can spend that funding on. So we have got a surplus that we've carried forward, and we can't just build that into the APT, because the APT is built around our allocation for 23-24. So we are more fixed in what we can do with that schools block. So, we could obviously any suggestions, or we can use, what we can also do is move those, whilst we've chose to ring fence the blocks, the carry forward on each of our blocks each year, we can choose to via the money between them if we see that there's a demand in another area, and to use it, and just to give us a little bit more flexibility on how we use that funding.
Thanks, Abby. I suppose where I'm coming from is that that we're not missing out on opportunities to get that money into schools, and I'm taking from what you said that we're not, and that the money into schools is determined by the NFF in effect, and it's just to kind of understand that we are not missing out on those opportunities, and it may well be, and you've identified what the pressures are coming up, and therefore having that surplus to carry forward is going to be helpful in the face of those pressures. But I've kind of like naively understood that we've been reluctant to put more money into high needs from the schools block because we're at risk of seeming to take away from schools. But if what you're saying that isn't the case, then maybe we need to revisit the money we are putting into high needs, because if the money's there, then perhaps it's got greater value to schools on the ground by sitting in high needs and alleviating some of the pressures there, possibly. But I think that's some of the analysis that needs to do.
Yeah.
Thanks, Graham. That's very helpful. Sorry I missed you before. I looked at a different screen. And Bruce, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Colin. And it was really just tying up the sort of two threads from Graham and Abby respectively. It is I think subsequently is been pointed out, the the contingency fund, which we're anticipating significant sort of demands on from reorganisations and potential reorganisations at Coquet and Berwick respectively, is drawn of course from the de-delegated funds from maintained schools. as opposed, but also sitting in the schools block is the generic deduction we make from the DSG in relation to growth and falling roles fund, which we acknowledge does come from both maintained schools and academies. But again, we don't anticipate making any further sort of demands on that this year, so there won't be any elements taken in respect of that, while we retain those sort of growth funds and falling roles fund on a sort of on a contingency or just in case basis.
Yeah, those two funds are essentially an insurance, and you don't cash an insurance in until you need it. So yeah, I take your point. Okay, any further questions on that for Abby, for Bruce? Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Abby, for that. Moving forward, item 9 and Bruce,
That's me again.
That's
Abby again. Yes, sorry,
this
is bringing us up to date. This is not the
Yes.
future. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes, this is just a budget update on the September, the performance across the DSG up to the end of September 22. And this incorporates any changes. This incorporates the transfer in that we're proposing from the surplus that we've just been discussing from 21-22. And it also discusses the updates to the DSG we've had since we first reported the grant back in February to yourselves. So we tend to get an update about once a quarter with various changes in. Our DSG allocation has come down since the original version we brought to you, but this is mainly linked to the 3 schools that academised on the 1st of April. So the DFE come along and recoup that funding. So it still stays within Northumberland's allocation, but the authority no longer has it. It transfers direct over to those academies. We've also had some sort of top-ups and clarification on like our early years block funding, which leads on from the last January's census. So in terms of where we are, I mean, we've been quite stable across the DSG so far this year, up to the September date. And we've got slight underspend across all of our blocks except for high needs. And I've identified in the report just some of the larger amounts, this more significant variances, just to draw your attention to where we are over underspending at the present time. Within the Central Schools block, we did have a historical commitment. So the Central Schools block funding is split between our historical element and our sort of current element of funding. Our historical element of funding reduces every year by 20%. Now this year, we had a larger than one of our commitments, which was a contribution towards a capital scheme, and that I think happened back in 2010 at Hexham Priory. That contribution that the DSG had committed to, that ended, and we have the second part of that ending in another year's time. So our costs dropped by more than the 20%, which has meant that we've scored a little bit this year on that historical funding, which makes a change. So we are underspending on our Central Schools block mainly due to the historical commitment dropping out. Early years block, it is too early in the day really to give a definitive forecast on that. The forecast we have is purely on the early years central funded team. Most of our services across the whole of the council are underspending on running costs and sort of travel costs, and it's largely due just to the difficulty in recruiting to vacancies. It is leading to staffing underspends across the board, which you'll see further down in the report. For the nursery funding, which is always the significant part of the early years block, once we get the autumn term payments made, we'll be able to start making some estimates, but we won't really know until the end of March what our position is, which it's just the way the funding works for that block, it's impossible to do it any earlier, but we can make some projections come January on where we think that block will end. Our high needs block is showing an overspend at the moment of 586,000. So there's the 2 key areas that we're overspending within high needs block is our top-ups, which is what you would expect. So whilst we had built in some growth, we're seeing growth that's exceeded the numbers have increased more than what we'd built in initially. And we've also seen a rise in some of the bands that the children are getting. So the average cost of a top-up is rising as well, which is just putting additional pressure on that budget. Now we've used that, we've based that across the payments that were made in the summer term, and we've built in additional growth of around 10% for the autumn and the spring term. So we'll shortly be able to assess at the end of December where we are, because the next term's payments will be made, and we can revise that number just based on what we know at the time. But hopefully we've picked up, we've added in significant enough growth to cover what could come out in the autumn term payment. We've also seen growth in our independent special schools this year. The numbers had reduced last year because we had a number of sort of year 11 leavers that dropped out on our independent school placement system. But this year, what we've seen is an increase in learners, predominantly at the lower cost packages, not necessarily at the higher cost, but we have seen an increase. But then there is the inflationary impact on our independent school placements. So we had built in inflation, but again, it's not sufficient to cover what's coming forward from negotiations with the various providers. So we've seen, we've currently got, at the end of September, we had 250 active placements, and that had increased by 26 since the July position. So it's risen again this month, I know. We've also seen a rise in the number of alternative children, but the cost of the inclusion service and the number of children that have been permanently excluded, which is 50 more at this point in time than it was in 21-22. So we've seen an overspend at the moment of around 90,000 on that. They've also got the added pressure of rising costs. There is a framework for alternative provision, but the providers themselves are significantly struggling, as are other providers in other sectors, and are coming to us seeking additional top-ups just to enable them to keep going and to have some sustainability and provision. So we've got a pressure there of around 90,000 at the moment. They also transport their pupils, and we're seeing additional pressure from the fuel costs and support to our transport providers that we are providing at the moment across the county. There is an underspend across our SEN support services, which has been due to vacant posts predominantly, and the fact that some of these posts have been able to be funded from the COMF funding that I previously mentioned, the Contain Outbreak Management funding. So we've been able to part fund posts. We hadn't anticipated being able to do that. We thought that grant was going to end at the end of March. They've extended it. We think our allocation will run out November, December time. At that point, the costs are going to have to come back into the DSG until the end of those fixed term posts. But we have seen an underspend of around 518,000. That's across several of our SEN support teams. And the other thing was just we had built in the formula for allocating sort of the additional notional SEN funding. Now we set a budget based on Bruce's figures that he did when we were setting the budget, which would have been probably January time, if not earlier. The actual cost for the summer term came out a little bit lower than what we were expecting. So we've got a bit of an underspend there of 84,000 based on our current costs, but that's subject to change as well. So in terms of the DSG overall, the overspend's quite small by comparison to previous years. It's 275,000 overspend overall. Our high needs block being the only area where we are overspent at 586,000. We're 6 months into the year, is quite early into the year. By the time we get sort of next month's report done, we'll be a lot clearer on what our costs are going to be towards the end of the year. So I expect that number to change. But just to be aware that obviously had we not transferred anything from the schools block into the high needs block, that would have been over £1 million this year. So we have still overspent on our high needs block allocation based on the current demands on our top-ups, alternative providers and independent school places. As I said, if we do overspend at the end of the year, then we will be able to draw down the balance from the reserve. And that will clear the balance back to zero for us, and it will reduce what we carry forward into 23-24. So that's a quick summary of where we are at the moment. As I say, we've been quite stable so far this year, but by the time we get to December, end of December, we should be able to update all of our forecasts around the placement provision, which is the big areas.
Thank you, Ivy. Clear as ever, thank you. And it strikes me, and I'm sure that people feel this as well, that those two papers provide a lot of helpful material to go forward, Audrey, into whatever you're going to put forward in the way of a summit. In terms of how we use our budget. I'm sure that's very helpful. And Avi, just one very quick sort of associated question. You've spoken about temporary posts in the inclusion unit. If the fund, or if or when the funding does run out, what happens to the employment rights of those people? Are these people that we might make redundant, or will we absorb them elsewhere?
Audrey, did you want to come in there before?
Yes,
yeah,
Audrey.
I was actually going to make a comment about those posts, because actually what the team managed to do, Chair, was use this fund really well. So we used it to make sure that we weren't then using high needs budget,
Okay.
and that left us a bit more in the budget. We didn't expect that fund to be able to extend into this business year. So from April the 1st, 2022 onwards, we expected that it would complete at the 31st of March, and it carried forward. So they are fixed term posts. The staff were recruited on fixed term.
Okay.
We are looking to see where and how we can support those to continue, just, you know, because they do extremely valuable work, and for all the reasons that we've talked about, getting good staff is a real challenge for us as well
Yeah.
as schools. And I'm very aware of some of the particular posts and the skill sets that we all need to do the jobs really well can be really,
Yeah.
really challenging to get. So when we do manage to get good staff who manage to fit the posts and the needs at that particular point, then it's always worth trying to work out how we manage to support those staff longer term. But they were employed on fixed term posts. So essentially, if the funding can't be secured, then that employment will end at the end of that.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. But I do take your point about trying to hang on to staff that have been developed and know their way around the subject. You know, thank you, Audrey. Bruce.
Just picking up both that point and the one he's made previously, looking at the section C at the bottom of 28 report, page 28 report, I think it's evident from the bullet points Abby's sort of highlighted there, while we are seeing an overspend overall in terms of the high needs block, actually what we're also seeing is a greater proportion of the funding being spent in schools, because it's the top up where the higher proportion and the overspends are now occurring. We know why, because of the greater demands there and the higher number of placements, both into special schools and to an extent into maintained schools, but also the, you know, in relation to the independent special schools spending as well. Greater number of placements being made, being up 10%, and that is going into, you know, into schools, albeit both inside and outside Northumberland in respect of that. So you're seeing an increasing, brutally simplistic about it, you're seeing an increasing proportion of the high needs budgets spent on pupils. The other element I just want to highlight as well, because I'm conscious that the forum supported previously the changes to the additional SEN funding, and we are underspending based on summer term, but we still at that point we're forecasting distributing around £340,000 using the new mechanism, as opposed to the £100,000 we were distributing previously. And again, we actually hope that that figure will go up when we look at the figures again in the autumn term.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions for Abby, Audrey, Bruce on any of that? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Abby. Thank you very much. Now to item 10. And finally, Bruce, I can bring you in.
Okay. I'm going to share a very brief presentation very swiftly first. It's an abridged version of what we took to the High Needs Committee. And of course, I've just lost the ability to share my screen. Share. Okay, just bear with me. Again, what I'm passporting here, hopefully people can see it. Information that was shared with us from the ESFA. I've chopped it down to just less than a dozen slides, and it isn't moving forward. There we go. Key changes to the school's national funding formula. I've just included that slide. It's been reflected in reports previously, but I think the key thing to identify is that, you know, the percentages being talked about for 23-24, we acknowledge are less than some of the inflationary pressures we're facing at the moment, in terms of, you know, 1.9%, additional elements on some of the factors. And again, the message very much from the ESFA is the fact that they're making comparisons back to 2 years ago, not to 1 year ago. Again, we've highlighted, and I've mentioned in the figures, the school supplementary grant that was paid separately in early 2022. It may be a source of frustration, but we have no indication of any additional funding being made available at this stage for 23-24. The idea of sort of tightening and mirroring in the local authorities are being driven towards the national funding formula factors now. I shared a table in the previous September report about the requirement to move at least 10% closer. Northumberland as authority isn't deemed to be exactly mirroring at the moment because we have one factor, which is the mobility factor outside of that 2.5% threshold. But again, we will be looking to address that this year. Minimum per pupil funding rates again have been highlighted and have only increased by 0.5%. Again, mobility, this issue for Northumberland, we are compelled to move 10% closer, but I think in line with the principles previously outlined, we intend to move in line with the national funding formula value should funding permit. Sparsity, again, highlighting the maximum sparsity values, which we will again include in our formula funding, a key area for Northumberland. Split site factor, we discuss split site factor in more detail in terms of the report because it's one of the areas highlighted in the latest national funding formula consultation, and we're working with that affects 4 schools in Northumberland, but we're working with those schools concerned, and again we'll pick up that in terms of the report. Exceptional circumstances forum will recall that we brought in January last year 2 specific exceptional circumstances requests, technically a disapplication request, where the exceptional circumstances rent, which is a fairly typical example, it was more than 1% of a school's budget, and they were duly approved. That request carries forward simply for this year in line with the final bullet point there. The minimum funding guarantee, just again highlighting the restriction in the levels for minimum funding guarantee for this year, and the fact we do formally need to consult with schools as well as schools forum on that, and that is part of the questionnaire attached to Appendix C of the agenda item 10 report. And again, capping and scaling. The opinion of formula funding in relation to capping and scaling, and we have reduced its influence as we move forward, as we move closer to national funding formula values, that it becomes, we've restricted its influence so the schools retain more of any formula gains. It becomes almost a tool of last resort. What we did for 22-23 was simply restrict any capping gains for people over and above 13%, which was a fairly high threshold. And I think the feeling of Formula Funding Committee was that we would continue to sort of marginalise, I think is the term I'm looking for, that in line with national funding formula. A final slide as well, because it's cropped up in a couple of discussions in relation to SEN. There is additional focus on SEN there. We obviously reviewed fundamentally our SEN calculations this year to identify an element by which could be used to support students on SEN support, on K-code, for those of you involved in school census, as well as students on plans and top-ups. And again, we've supported that with additional funding for the 23-24. I'm now going to stop sharing if I can work out how. Okay, thank you very much. And just returning to the report for item 10, this is a formal consultation report, so we are asking Schools Forum for agreements in line with the recommendations at paragraph 2, in terms of agreeing to a transfer of up to 0.25% from the schools block to the high needs block, agree that funding values are set in line with the principles outlined elsewhere on the report and the meeting, noting the delegation of final decisions simply because of the timescales involved to Audrey as Interim Director of Children's Services, and receive a final report in January. I'm conscious Audrey has a hand up, so I'm going to just pause briefly at that point.
Sorry, it's an old hand, Bruce.
Oh, a legacy hand. It's a while
No,
since I heard that phrase.
I'll just say old. So don't worry about it. My apologies. Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Audrey. Again, much of the other information in the report shouldn't be new. We'd highlighted a slight change in tone in the September report. I just wanted to repeat. Previously, there'd been no firm fixed target date, but there has now been an expectation to local authorities to move to the direct formula within the next 5 years, or by 27-28. We've touched on school supplementary grant already. Summary figures there shown in the table at paragraph 4. The provisional 23-24 figures are in the column headed in brackets October 2021, previous October 2021 data. Again, at the risk of repeating myself, I do need to sort of highlight the caveats and the potential issues in relation to that, because as we know, school data does fundamentally change year on year, and we need to bear that in mind for when we receive the final figures through in late December. Minimum per pupil funding has caused some discussions both at Formula Funding Group and the previous schools forum. We've identified that historically the minimum per pupil funding levels were responsible within the overall settlement for around 2.451 million. We anticipate that the lower level of 0.5 this year could drop that figure to 1.558, and potentially impacting on 22 schools within Northumberland. Again, based on last year's data, but that's what's the best information we have to model on at the moment. And item 6, again, just setting a little bit of context. Forum members may recall we consulted last year with both Schools Forum and wider schools and requested agreement to transfer up to 0.5% from the schools block to the high needs block for 2022-23. That was supported by both Forum and in the subsequent schools consultation, which was reported back to Forum in January. Following further analysis and obviously receipt of final settlement figures in December, we decided as a local authority to reduce that transfer from 0.5% to 0.25%, and the final figure transferred was essentially 515,000 rather than the original estimated 1.043. As reported to Schools Forum, and again, as Abby's outlined previously on the agenda, because of some of the exceptional circumstances arising from COVID, overall balances of 4.032 million were reported, including a 1.8 million for high needs block. However, we're also highlighting, as has been discussed elsewhere on the agenda, future pressures such as rising expenditure for alternative provision, an 11% increase in education, health and care plans, which essentially remain the key drivers of costs for SEN despite not being in the high needs formula, as well as the decision to continue to offer the Northumberland inclusive education services free at the point of delivery for all the reasons David outlined earlier. And again, we've outlined the financial monitoring reports that Abby presented previously, highlight a £586,000 overspend, which will offset against that 1.8 million, together with this planned spend of just over £100,000 outlined in the previous report. We have other additional pressures potentially identified in 23-24, including the opening of the new Gilbert Ward Special Free School Academy in Blythe in September 23. 40 estimated places required initially is likely to cost in the region of, again, £420,000 top-up funding, £426,000 place funding for a full year, but potentially £580,000 for the 2 terms within the 23-24 financial year. And again, this doesn't take into consideration the general growth in numbers. What it's important to see as well is, generally speaking, what we're not doing is able to move children out of existing settings into Gilbert Ward because simply it's a cheaper option, maybe in relation to independent school settings. That's not something that's done. What we will be doing within relation to will be new placements. It saves us longer term because we're not making those more expensive placements within independent care, but there is a long sort of turnaround in relation to that before any savings is evident. And again, we've talked about plan numbers and NIAS already. Again, we'll undertake to provide further information at the January and February meetings in relation to this following the final funding settlement. But again, we're asking for Schools Forum support to the potential transfer of up to 2.25%, or approximately, based on the provisional figures, 546,000 from the schools block to the high needs block. I'm going to pause for breath and any questions at that point.
First one from me, as always, Bruce. Yeah, my mic's on.
Yeah.
To what extent are you watching for the Chancellor's statement tomorrow? I mean, there's a lot of future stuff going to be thrown at us tomorrow, but do you anticipate that anything might impact on the 23-24 year?
Everybody may have a personal view about this. Mine would be, at this stage, a lot of the sort of the soundings and the noises are coming out of government at this point are about what a hard budget it's going to be, about increases across the board in terms of taxation, and my concerns would be specifically in relation within that context, when everybody's being asked to feel some of the pain, whether or not there would be any positive messages in terms of education funding in relation to that. My concern is there won't be. Again, it was late last year when it was later than this in the financial year cycle when we found out about the special supplementary grant figure. Yeah. It was January essentially. And it may be that something is delayed, or it may be we do have to face the fact that maybe that there is no additional support there at all, and that's it's hard. It may be an unpalatable truth given some of the pressures we're talking about, but that's why, in terms of discussions, the potential use of reserves to balance budgets during this period of great uncertainty for 23-24 isn't certainly a dirty word at this point, if you, of course, have the reserves to do that. And I appreciate all schools aren't in that position.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough answer, Bruce. Right, can I throw this open for questions and comments to all members, please? I don't know whether it's good or not good that there is silence there.
It may be a footpath already trod, Colin. If we're happy to continue through the rest of the paper and then pick up any other issues at the end.
Yeah, please carry on.
Again, just section 7, minimum formula guarantee. Again, Formula Funding Committee quite rightly asked for an illustration of the impact of setting the minimum formula guarantee at the different respective rates. That's in that very simple table, evident in that very simple table. It's section 7. Again, as outlined in the final line of the report, as ever, subject to finances available, my inclination, my recommendation would be that we would look to set MFG at the maximum level at 0.5%. For 23-24, so the maximum amount of schools receive some benefit of that, even though it may be thin in the context of some of the overall pressures we've been talking about. Moving on, central services block, again, just a summary in relation to that. Abby's already expertly outlined that although we have a pressure in terms of that, although the historic commitments as has been headlined by the ESFA continues to unwind, we can manage that within the context of the reduced liabilities arising from the capital costs at Hexham in the current financial year, in the next financial year. A nod, and I know it's a frustration of David's, to the fact that we do not, as of yet, receive any early years block data, and the earliest indication we get is the revised funding position in the figures that will come through around the 17th or 18th of December. Section 10, dedelegation. We again don't anticipate any changes to dedelegation for 23-24. We've outlined the services we saw dedelegation for in 22-23. We don't anticipate that changing in 23-24, both in relation to either the services concerned or at the rates we take. we would take dedelegation that. So we again anticipate that that would be frozen for 23-24. Other information, again, Forum has overseen a relatively smooth transition towards a national funding formula. One element I've touched on already is this idea about the split site factor. There's 4 schools in Northumberland who benefit from a split site factor, acknowledging, as I think is generally the case, and we acknowledge that there are additional costs involved, both through sort of maintaining additional separate premises, maintaining some sort of front of house or security issues to across both sites, and we have maintained a factor. We've made a payment in acknowledgement of this in Northumberland of £62,000 over the last few years, and to be fair, that figure hasn't been unchanged, I think, certainly for 3 or 4 years. One of the elements buried away in the latest consultation, and I'm conscious that maybe an element of consultation overload around this when we're largely there, was how the ESFA proposes to nationalise, if you like, the split site factor. That's outlined in the information at section 11. This has been flagged through the 4 schools concerned for comment and for an information return, which the ESFA is seeking to inform this position. I think essentially what we're saying is that we would anticipate that we consider moving to that proposed national funding formula approach for 23-24 for the rates. My reason in recommending that is simply because the premises elements are funded on a historic basis within the national funding formula. So if we agree those elements with the Education and Skills Funding Agency, those elements will be uplifted for the subsequent financial year 24-25, so it doesn't have any negative impact on the overall funding available. It makes that pie that little bit bigger, albeit on a ring-fence basis for the 4 schools involved, but it does bring in more money to schools within Northumberland, so it's something I'm advocating in respect of that. I'll again pause and see if there are any specific questions in relation to that item. We'll come back to Appendix B following the end of this report. Again, Section 12 outlines the next steps, where we will run a consultation with schools, which would propose to run from Tuesday the 22nd of November, which would be next Tuesday, to 12 noon on Monday the 12th of December. That parallels the time frame we ran the consultation for this last year. We've attached a copy of the draft consultation paper at Appendix C at the back of this report. Following the outcome of those consultations, we will prepare and submit a report to Cabinet on the 10th of January, and the submission of final figures to the ESFA by the 20th of January, interspersed, of course, with an additional schools forum on the 18th. That is essentially in line with the process we have followed previously and doesn't represent any sort of changes to that. Simply to say it's obviously a really tight deadline around Christmas. The figures I refer to in section 11 again are attached as an appendix, as a separate Appendix B. We've listed schools simply in alphabetical order. The caveat I would, of course, apply to those figures is that while it'll seem a higher increase than it feels like, because that is specifically the distribution of the school's DSG, it doesn't reflect those school supplementary grant figures that were paid to each individual school for 2022-23. And again, those figures again will all change in line with both pupil and other factor data being updated as per the October 2022 census. Finally, the other appendices attached to the item 10 report, an outline of what the funding factors will be or are proposed to be. For 23-24, you will see that essentially we mirror exactly the national funding formula values. And then there is a proposed consultation with schools attached at Appendix C, providing some additional information and highlighting links where schools and those interested can find additional information at various places on the schools forum website. And we then consulted on 4 key questions around minimum funding guarantee, around the use of capping and scaling, around the transfer from the schools block to the high needs block, and again the proposed review of the split site element, with an area for any further comments available at the end of the consultation paper. Okay, I'm going to pause for breath and any questions at that point, Chair. You're on mute again, Colin. Sorry, apologies.
I've got a cold and I keep switching on and off so I can blow my nose. Yeah, a very, very quick question. How do we take into account the comments from the consultation with schools, Bruce?
Well, we have an opportunity the comments will be reflected in both the cabinet report in terms of consultation and then reflected in the report we bring in January.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So again,
so there is an opportunity for us to see those. Yeah,
there is.
Smashing. Okay, thank you. Can I throw this open then for question and comment, please? I'm getting the feeling that you've done some great preparatory work here, Bruce. Sorry, David, carry on.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Bruce. Just a question. I don't know if this is possible or even appropriate, but in terms of we've got all the breakdowns there, and it does mention thankfully some increases in school budgets as percentages and changes over time in line with the formula and so on and so forth. Do we have anything, or is it possible for us to do something where we also look at the increases in the costs to schools? So those areas of expenditure that have gone up, we mentioned fuel, staffing costs, and what have you. We've got one of the appendices has got a great breakdown of the increase in the funding that's going to come to each school. I don't want to set anyone a massive job to do, but in terms of reporting to council, it's interesting to say this is the increases and are matching to national funding formula, which is really important, and you've done a brilliant job in getting us close on that. But is there anything which tells us about the increase in, and I know it can be difficult because a school might employ they're not likely to, but employ more staff, and that's why the costs have gone up. But something specifically about staffing increasing costs and fuel.
We can pull that together, certainly. We have got some data on, I think we've got it in separate places on the impact of the fuel and separately on the cost of the pay award. So yeah, we can certainly arrange to pull something together just to get a wider picture on the impact for each phase, possibly rather than each school. But yeah, we can do that and bring that back to the next meeting.
Thank you, Abby. Yeah. That's very helpful. Graham Atkins.
Just on that, I might say a bit of work. This Schools Cuts website, which I think the NEU have put together, is actually pretty accurate. It doesn't reflect the 2022 pay award increases, but it factors them into 23, 24. But certainly you can put in schools details and it gives you a fairly accurate indication as to the impact on those schools.
And that's, I think, going back to one of the key arguments there is about the real terms impact compared to, I think, going back to 2010 is their original base point, Graham, if I'm correct. I think that might be it. Yeah.
Okay. Mike Dean Hall.
Just really concurring with what Graham and David have said, but also to factor in, certainly for first and primary schools, the impact on food inflation. That also I think needs to be considered too, because there's obviously a fixed rate comes in for the universal infant free school meals beyond the free school meal amounts, and we're seeing inflationary pressures in the food of a high 20s% going up each month. So I think I would agree strongly to say that those inflationary costs pay awards, energy, food, and so forth need to be clear for cabinet members as well as they are for schools, to indicate what needs to happen, and actually real-time pressures on school budgets, not just that there is potential increase coming through, but how they match up with the expenditure as well.
Yeah, I acknowledge that, you know, those pressures could be helped to illustrate the position for cabinet. It unfortunately doesn't necessarily make the grant any bigger that we're currently looking at, but I accept we can provide, you know, it would be appropriate to provide that context to it, Mike. That's a good point.
Yeah, I'd agree. It doesn't fix it, but it certainly would provide clarity of understanding across where schools are and how they're trying to meet those demands and needs with potentially reduced income.
Thanks, Mike. Bruce, is it possible to say something about the situation of early years providers, particularly the PIV ones, you know, who we know have been under a lot of pressure for a long time?
I wouldn't dare speak authoritatively on behalf of PVI's providers when we've got somebody far better placed to do that as part of the forum. But I think what it does, what I can say is many of the pressures we've talked about in terms of, you know, in terms of the pay and price inflation pressure apply equally, if not more so, to PIV providers, because again, we're looking, you know, we've talked about the Nicola earlier talked about the pressures in terms of recruitment, and PIV providers are again sort of fishing in the same or a comparable pool in respect of that, and are also facing the same pressures in terms of, you know, utility provisions and the day-to-day sort of price inflation we all face. I don't know whether Kath is hopefully still on the call and would like to add anything additional to that.
Kath? She's still showing. Are you there, Kath?
Sorry, can you hear us now?
Yes. Thanks, Kath.
No, it's exactly the same as you said. It's the same pressures as everybody else. I'll just turn that down. It's recruitment is very, very difficult, and that has an impact on the number of children that providers will take in. There are a number of providers looking at reducing the number of funded places, because if they take in a private paying child, they can get more money. So that's something. The other issue that PVIs face is if they take a child in with additional needs, there's a minimum of 6 weeks, sometimes 12 weeks before you can get any additional funding, because you've got to have action review cycles in place. Now, for example, we've taken in 2 PMLD children who need one-to-one support immediately, but we can't access any funding for them until either now or January. Wow. Now, the way we operate, we just put everything to a big pot like a special school and sorted from there. But a lot of other PVIs don't work in the same way, so then can't do that. Yeah. And they're not able to take a child in if they need that one-to-one support, because they don't have the funding for it. And you can't get the funding until the child's in and you've done the work with the child, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Gosh, thank you for that, Kath. I mean, these issues just go on and on. David, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to say from an early years perspective for the nurseries, the way the funding is distributed and the wizard, which is a tool used to make the payments to, does give a lot of clarity. So I think PVIs are probably in a better position than ever before in terms of knowing what, it might not be enough, but at least knowing the pounds and pence that are coming in, and the reasons why. So the other element of support for the sector is that the early years team have 2.5 probably members of staff who have a dedication within their job descriptions to finance and sufficiency in particular, so that if there are any PVIs that start to struggle or recognising that the struggle, there is free support available to go through the numbers to maximise their funding and their access to the funding. And even from a SEND perspective, there is some flexibility within the inclusion fund, so that it might not help somebody on day one, Kath, but there is the capabilities and the possibilities to discuss with the panel costs that maybe already have been incurred. I appreciate that might mean a gamble on the PVI's perspective in terms of not knowing for certain the money's coming, but actually with the right discussions and particularly a PMLD learner, you pretty much we could say that the funding will be backdated to cover those early weeks. Having said that, that isn't guaranteed until the panel have made that decision. So I appreciate that might add some thoughts in an element of risk for the provider.
I'd like to say, Audrey, that's just something else to throw into your pot. And I'm sure you'll take that on board. I'm reminded whenever I hear a discussion about early years, I can't remember the name of the paper, and I'm sure I've mentioned it at the Schools Forum before, from Ofsted, the last head of Ofsted, whose name I can never remember. And I wish I could remember the name of the paper. This is why I'm retiring as chair of the School Forum. I can't remember anything. Short-term memory, it's awful. But essentially that paper was highlighting the need to capture children in the education system. In the education system by the time they're 6. Otherwise,
wait a minute, I won't give you necessarily if you start listening.
Don't know where that is, or essentially they're potentially lost to the system. And you know, I've read that paper several times, and I find it quite moving. So this is something that I always carry in my head. But anyway, thank you for that. Thank you. Any further questions?
Mike's had his hand up for a couple of moments there,
Sorry,
Chair.
yeah, Mike Dean Hall.
Thank you. Yeah, just to reinforce what Kath was saying about the pressures on the early years side of thing, we run a nursery here as well.
Yeah.
And the recent application of the now agreed pay award from a context here has moved my nursery from being in the black to being immediately in the red.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine that is being duplicated across both PVIs and community settings like ours. So it is a real concern. Again, there's no solution that I'm aware of to it, other than you then start messing around with your staffing. You're in competition with some of the retail jobs of a similar pay grade, which are probably a little less stressful, and pay is going up in the private sector in terms of retail jobs and those things. So that is very difficult to recruit. But also just you've been in a catch-22 of trying to manage your ratios and then trying to manage reducing staff costs. And if you reduce staff costs, you reduce placements, and then you reduce income, and it's a really complex thing. And I'm not aware, David, of any changes to the amount per pupil in the early years sector coming through for next year.
The bit of the frustration that's been mentioned twice already, I think, from Bruce and Abby there, in the fact that the early years block allocation, we don't know it yet. We don't know it till quite late on, which always means that it feels like we have a rushed process through sort of January, February into March to set April the 1st's hourly rates. But all the comments made today, I think, will add to the desire to pass on any increases that do come. And like we did last year, we actually increased the rates beyond the increase in funding, due to some some funding that came in at a later date, which we hadn't been able to allocate the year before. So we reallocated it for the hourly rates for this year. But the discussions around the rates is to how can we pass on the maximum to the providers. And the only other thing, and I'm not sure if this is positive in terms of a step, but there is some discussion about being more relaxed on ratios.
It's not necessarily comfortable.
No.
Certainly for 2-year-olds and the younger ones, that's a worrisome.
That's from a DFE source, really. Yeah. In terms of them trying to square the circle between increasing costs of staffing and whatever is well, if the ratios were higher, then we'd be able to we'd get more funding in for less staff. But again, whether the impact on quality education therefore is another issue again.
Yeah. Okay. No hands up. nobody indicating that they want to ask further questions, can I draw your attention back to paragraph 2 of Bruce's paper, which are the recommendations that we're asked to sign up to? Are we comfortable with those? And I'll take silence as agreement. Okay, Bruce?
Okay, that's appreciated. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Forum.
Yeah. Okay. That's a biggie. So I'm just going to say, Bruce, Audrey, David, anything else that you want to add to that? We've got into it fairly in a fair amount of detail. Okay. The next item is just future meetings, if I can find my agenda.
That's
the work
right,
program.
Colin. Nothing to add there. Then obviously the next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, the 18th of January. Again, we will that virtually, and we'll obviously bring further information, including what the actual settlement has been to that meeting.
Okay. Right. Okay. I have no urgent business to bring forward. Anything anyone else would like to raise? Okay. Many thanks. I think this has been the Schools Forum at its best. We've got some really, really good, clear and cogent presentations, a lot of really good responses from officers and some, key probing questions from members. So well done. Thank you very much. Have a great Christmas and we will see you in January. Thank you.
You too,
Bye.
Chair. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you.